In 1934, a grieving mother in New York received a letter. It was handwritten, neatly folded, and addressed directly to her by name. Inside was no apology, no ransom. What she read was something far worse. It was a calm, detailed explanation of how her 10-year-old daughter had been killed, butchered, and eaten by a man. That man was Albert Fish. He looked like someone's frail old grandfather, but behind his harmless appearance was one of the most twisted, sadistic minds in human history. A man who inserted needles into his own body, tortured children, and called himself a sacrifice machine for God. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His father was 75 years old when he was born, and his mother was 43 at the time. Such a dramatic parental age gap may have quietly contributed to Fish's later breakdown of age-related moral boundaries. He also had several relatives who suffered from severe mental illness, with his brother later being committed to a mental institution, and his sister, mother, and uncle all being diagnosed with different forms of mental illness. With Fish later in life being quoted saying, "Insanity runs in my family like water through a sieve." Albert Fish's father died when he was just 5 years old of a heart attack at a train station. After this, his mother could no longer financially support the children alone, and put Albert into a local orphanage where he remained until the age of 10. This is where he claims his love for pain began. He was beaten, whipped, and humiliated by staff and older boys, and started to associate pain with pleasure. He later explained it by saying, quote, "I was there until I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were whipped. I saw boys doing things. I got to like it." This created what's called sadomasochism in his mind, which is defined as the desire to inflict or receive pain for arousal. During this time, he began beating himself, often using handmade paddles or switches. In 1880, Albert's mother found work again and was finally able to take him out of the orphanage. But by then, the damage had already been done. Though he was often described as quiet, polite, and obedient, the years of abuse had left deep psychological scars. He never received more than an early elementary education, but through self-teaching, he was later believed to have average, or even above average, intelligence. At 11 or 12 is when he started calling himself Albert instead of his given name of Hamilton. The name Albert came from a younger sibling of his who had passed away, with some psychologists speculating this was the start of his identity detachment. Through his teens, Albert worked small jobs to help support his mother, but behind the quiet routine, his mind was already unraveling, filled with violent fantasies and vivid graphic hallucinations. In his late teens or early 20s, Albert relocated to New York City, which is where the persona he'd kept buried for so long started to show. He took a job as a house painter, but what he did when he was not working was the real concern. He started to frequent public bathhouses to observe young boys undress, visit brothels and ask for extreme pain to be inflicted on him, stick needles into his own groin and abdomen, many of which would remain for decades, read articles on cannibalism, torture, and execution, and also develop sick religious delusions, believing pain brought him closer to God. Despite all of this, it seemed really nobody knew about any of this, and for the next 40-ish years he would live in and around New York City, painting homes and doing random jobs from classified ads all around. During this time, he would also get married to a woman named Anna Mary Hoffman and have 6 kids together with her. And while he was reportedly not abusive to his kids, he did subject them to bizarre and disturbing behavior, like when he would be wandering the house naked, quoting scripture and asking them to beat him with paddles. And while still married to his wife, in 1910, his first horrific crime happened in Wilmington, Delaware, under the pretense of it being another one of his handyman type of jobs. Thomas Kedden was a mentally disabled 19-year-old male who was supposedly hired by Albert and brought out to a rented farmhouse. This is where Albert tied him up and tortured him for 2 weeks, and then proceeded to cut off his penis with a pair of scissors. He then left him $10 and fled the state. Thomas survived this attack, but the person who did it was never found. Albert would later confess that he did this but was never formally charged with the crime because of lack of evidence, which will become a sadly recurring theme in this story. His wife left him in 1917 for another man, which only deepened his descent into madness. And in 1924, he killed for the first time 8-year-old Francis McDonnell, a boy living in Staten Island, New York. Witnesses reported the boy being seen walking with a, quote, elderly gray man, being the source of where he was given the first of his many nicknames. The Gray Man, which is also the name of the 2007 movie made about him. Then, later that same day, 8-year-old Francis was found hanging from a tree in the woods near his home. He had been strangled with his suspenders, beaten, and sexually assaulted. Fish later said, quote, I had no intention of killing him, but I got such a thrill out of the act that I couldn't stop. Yet once again, he was never formally convicted of this crime because of lack of evidence. But of course, they had another nickname for him, the Werewolf of Wisteria. Then, in 1927, Albert managed to go even lower. In Brooklyn, New York, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney and his 3-year-old friend were reportedly playing in the hallway of a low-end apartment building where they lived, and were alone at the time. This is when, from the words of the 3-year-old friend of Billy, the boogeyman took Billy. Albert Fish abducted Billy in broad daylight, and years later in his confession said, quote, I took him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone. I stripped him naked. I cut off his ears, nose. I slit his mouth from ear to ear. I stuck the knife in his belly and drank his blood. Fish then described cooking his flesh with onions, carrots, and bacon fat. No remains were ever found, but the clothing of the child was identified by Gaffney's mother. Yet once again, he was never charged with this crime, and instead was just given more nicknames by the press of the Boogeyman and the Brooklyn Vampire. Then, 1 year later, the most infamous case would occur in Manhattan, New York. Albert Fish, as he always had, answered a classified ad placed by 10-year-old Grace Budd's older brother, 18-year-old Edward Budd, seeking work. Albert posed as a man named Frank Howard, a benevolent old farmer, and over a period of time gained the Budd family's trust, visiting them multiple times. Then, on his third visit, being on June 3, 1928, he asked to take 10-year-old Grace Budd to a supposed birthday party, to which the family agreed. She left with him and would never be seen again. Albert would get away with this for the next 6 years, and while none were confirmed, he was suspected of many other killings and abductions of children over these 6 years. But then in 1934, Albert decided to write a letter to the mother of Grace Budd, with this letter being one of the most disturbing documents in criminal history. Starting the letter with, My dear Mrs. Budd, Albert begins to recount hearing about a famine in China when he was young, where a 5-year-old boy was allegedly kidnapped, stripped naked, tied up, and sold to a butcher, then cut up and eaten by a village. Albert says this event fascinated him and planted the idea of cannibalism in his mind, with this seemingly just being used to sound like a sad attempt of a justification for what he will write next. He then suddenly shifts from the Chinese story to his own crime, claiming he never intended to kill Grace, and how he originally came to the Budd family's home to kill Edward Budd, the older brother of Grace. But upon seeing Grace, he became obsessed with her instead. Then he moved to the actual killing of Grace Budd. What you're about to hear are the exact words Albert Fish wrote to Grace Budd's mother. And I have to warn you, this is no doubt one of the darkest things ever put to paper. Albert writes, quote, I took her to the empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. Then, as if it couldn't get any worse, he ends the letter with, "I did not fuck her. I could have had I wished. She died a virgin," seemingly trying to portray as if he showed some kind of remorse. After the mother read this letter in horror, she of course handed it all over to the police, hoping they would be able to find this person. The letter was not signed, but the envelope gave the police one small clue. The envelope he used bore the printed letterhead of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Detectives recognized the name and tracked it to a boarding house at 200 East 52nd Street in Manhattan, where that association had once operated. Upon investigation, the building manager informed police that an elderly man named Albert Fish had recently rented a room there but had since moved out. The manager also confirmed that the distinctive stationery Fish used to write the letter had been available in the building's common area, such as the writing room or parlor, giving Fish access to it. Tenant records confirmed Fish had used his real name and stayed in a specific room. This allowed investigators to conclusively connect Fish to the letter. And so, detectives staked out the boarding house. And on December 13th, 1934, Albert Fish returned to collect a check he was expecting, and plainclothes Detective William F. King approached him and asked for his name. Once confirmed to be Albert Fish, he was arrested and is quoted to have said, "I suppose I had it coming." Upon searching Albert's person and belongings, police found a meat cleaver, a small handsaw, a butcher knife, a blood-stained rag, newspaper clippings about missing children, and a list of children's names, with some being real and some remaining unknown. X-rays later revealed 29 self-inflicted needles embedded in his pelvis. Next, Detective King interrogated him over several weeks, where he would calmly and descriptively confess to the killings of Francis McDonnell, Billy Gaffney, and Grace Budd, and also the torturing of Thomas Kedden. Albert Fish also claimed to have molested and/or assaulted over 400 children in his lifetime, with him confessing to 3 murders, but being suspected of around 5 others, with his reasoning being that God ordered him to kill children, though he also said, "I like children. They are tasty," directly contradicting his prior reasoning. The trial was held in White Plains, New York in 1935, under Judge Frederick P. Close, with the only charge being put against him being the murder of Grace Budd because of the lack of evidence for his other confessions. The defense argued that Fish was legally insane, citing family history of mental illness, his self-mutilation, and his cannibalism and voices from God. They then brought in psychiatrists who testified he suffered from multiple paraphilic disorders, including sexual pleasure from pain, mutilation, feces, cannibalism, and non-consensual actions. "He is the most insane man I've ever examined," said one expert. They also brought in his eldest son, Albert Fish Jr., who testified about his father's odd behaviors at home, helping establish his psychological condition. The prosecution's response to this was that Albert Fish was sane because he carefully planned his crimes, he used aliases and manipulation, and he knew right from wrong, as shown by his efforts to avoid capture. Psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wortham stated, "He was a sadist, not psychotic. He knew what he was doing." After 10 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 1 hour. Their verdict? Guilty of first-degree murder. And the sentence was death by electric chair, The jury admitted they believed he was insane, but said he still deserved to die for what he had done. Albert was then held at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, awaiting his execution. The guards described him as a quiet guy who spent his time reading the Bible, writing letters and confessions, and talking to himself. Then, after about 10 months, on January 16, 1936, shortly after 11 p.m., about a dozen police, doctors, and press sat around in the witness chamber that was separated by a glass window from the execution room, where now 65-year-old Albert Fish sat facing them in the electric chair. He had just finished his final meal of salted cod, potatoes, and a glass of orange juice. Then, just 6 minutes later, he would be pronounced dead, with his final words being quoted as, "I don't even know why I'm here." Fish's body was so saturated with needles from the years of self-mutilation that the first jolt short-circuited the chair, and a second jolt was needed to kill him. Albert was buried in the prison cemetery at Sing Sing in an unmarked grave where he will never be able to hurt another child again. Before he died, Albert Fish wrote a detailed account of all his crimes for his lawyer, who never shared the writings because they were simply too horrific, which I think we can all agree is most definitely for the best. Albert Fish is now considered one of the most disturbed criminals in recorded history for obvious reasons. Not just for what he did, but for how he thought. He blended extreme sadomasochism, religious delusion, and paraphilic disorders into a quiet, calculated life of horror. His case is still studied today as a rare convergence of mental illness, trauma, and violent compulsion, the kind that warps a person beyond recognition, or in this case, beyond human.
You weren't hated, you were feared, and that was what you loved the most.